Hi there, I'm Dr. Jill Wener. I am a internal medicine doctor, a meditation teacher, tapping practitioner, and author, and I'm an aspiring anti-racist. And I am here with, this is like off the charts, unprecedented awesome, because I'm here with Dr. Stan Sonu, who is a internal medicine pediatrics generalist and associate program director for the residency program in internal medicine at Emory, which is awesome enough. But the unprecedented awesome part is that Stan was my resident when I used to practice medicine at Rush in Chicago. So Stan and I have reconnected over the years. But he's been doing some incredible work in this space. So you'll find out more about why I'm interviewing him right now. So Stan, thank you so much for being here and for agreeing to
Thanks for inviting me. I'm really glad to be here and looking forward to this discussion.
This is great. So I think I'd like to start on a personal front and get to some of the work you've done in this space a little bit later. But I saw a post from you on Facebook pretty early on in the pandemic about the way you, and for people who are listening, Stan is Asian, for people who are not watching.
Yeah.
And talking about your experiences as an Asian American at the beginning of this pandemic. And I haven't seen posts since then. There may have been others that I haven't seen, but I think that there's so much focus on anti-Black racism. And there's so many different experiences of anyone who is not the like full-on majority white in this country. So I'd love to hear a little bit from you, what your experience has been like from your ethnicity, from your race, and also how that has been during COVID and what that's been like for you to navigate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm Korean by ethnicity, and I was born in this country. I was born in Illinois and moved to the South when I was around 2 years old. My dad was finishing up grad school. He finished up his degree at Georgia Tech, and then been growing up in the South ever since, I grew up in the South ever since then. And my primary culture has been American since the day I was aware that I could speak and aware of culture and everything else. And so growing up, I noticed the contrast pretty early on. I don't remember at what age, but I definitely remember it was fairly early in my elementary school years when I kind of noticed that at home we speak Korean, and then at school we speak English. And I'm a lot better at English than I am at speaking Korean. And so at kind of an early age, I in some ways identified more with the American side of my identity versus the Korean side.
Mm-hmm.
But I think both were certainly held in tension throughout my school years, and especially college and med school, and even to this day. Definitely, I think the experience of racism for Asian Americans is very different than that of Black Americans in this country, for obvious historical reasons. Like, we weren't brought in ships against our will 400 years ago. That's certainly not in our history. I will say that there are some similarities and if you kind of zoom out and on a broad level or in broad strokes, in the sense of, one way to think about racism is that it's a position in which someone doesn't belong, or someone shouldn't be there, or someone's experience isn't valid, or their needs are not valid for some reason.
Yeah.
And so I've certainly felt like that, been made to feel that way in various instances throughout my life. To get to your question, I'm sorry, I have to clear my throat. To get to your question, though, when the pandemic hit, I had heard or read kind of bits and pieces, news reports coming out of China and I think Italy, where there were some very discriminatory incidents, racist incidents that were against Asian Americans, and they were kind of random. I mean, it was just like very overt examples of racism, racial epithets and discriminatory language being said, and And so I was a little bit, I was like, oh, that's kind of weird. But at the time, kind of early in, in January of 2020, no one was really thinking like this was gonna be what it is right now.
Right.
Um, and but I was a little, I mean, I think the nerve there's always a raw nerve exposed with when it comes to racism, and I think being a person of color, even as I consider myself a privileged person of color in this country, there's always kind of a nerve there of like, huh, like anything can happen. Even, I mean, sidebar, just 2 days ago, my family and I, my wife and our two young kids, we went to the botanical gardens, had a great time. Everybody was wearing a mask. We stopped to look at this one fountain, and my son was saying, "Oh, there's tadpoles, and I can see some tadpoles here." And another kid, maybe age 9 or 10, walked by, looked into the pond, saw the tadpoles, looked at my son, and goes, "Konnichiwa," and just walks off.
Oh,
And
wow.
so my wife, yeah, my wife hears that and is like, I didn't hear it. My wife hears it and she goes, wrong language or something like that. And she was kind of pissed off at herself after the fact, saying like, I should have said something else. I mean, the only thing I could think of was wrong language.
Right.
Um, but she really wanted to like go talk to the kid's parents. But
Right.
so even like things like that, there's always like this little nerve that's exposed as much as we try to cover it up, where it's like anything can happen at any point in any time we step out in public. Now it's never, I think it's not something that gets irritated or agitated every time we go out, but it's happened enough to the extent like it's just kind of there, it's in the background.
Yeah.
But yeah, the story that you're referring to in what I posted on Facebook was something that happened at work. I was wearing this was kind of early on when masks were being suggested, I guess, and the only people that had to wear a mask at this time were healthcare workers. And this was a policy not from the state or anything like that, but just from our hospital. They said every health provider needs to wear a mask. So I'm in my car. I'm putting on the surgical mask. I'm looking at myself in the mirror to make sure it's straight. And I'm like, oh my goodness, like all they can see are my eyes. That's like the thought I had in my head. All they can see are my eyes, and what's going to happen today. And then I'm like, wait a minute, this is ridiculous. Like, why am I jumping to this immediate conclusion that something is going to happen? Like I need to get over my insecurity. But anyway, I go into clinic, and it was maybe 30 seconds after I had sat down that like these comments just kind of came in. And it wasn't like a flood of comments throughout the entire day, but there were like 3 or 4 discrete comments that were said to me. I think one staff member, like when I walked in, actually after I sat down, I went back out to like wash my hands. A staff member sees me and is like, "Whoa, coronavirus." And like again, it's kind of weird to say it now because it's so like we're so tired of hearing about COVID. But
Right.
back then it was like, wait a minute, like why are you looking at me saying coronavirus? And then one of my colleagues uh, was just walking through the clinic just to say hi. She sees me and she goes, "Oh, are you patient zero?" And then
Mm.
that one kind of pissed me off. I was like, well, okay, like, and then she tried to be chummy with me coming in the room, like giving people's hugs. And I'm like, I really am not in the mood to give you any attention. And you don't even notice like what you said was kind of hurtful.
Yeah.
Um, I'm like primed to just be, it's just a sensitive spot,
Yeah.
just from what I look like. I can't control that. And then there was there was a resident who came in, resident or a a trainee who has graduated med school. I think for your audience, a trainee who's graduated med school, but they're still in training, which is called a residency. And so a resident comes in to sign out a patient that I'm supervising, or I'm supervising him. We go back into the room after he tells me about the patient, and no, like I'm not trying to disparage anybody in particular, but the patient just said some things that were very exposing, I guess. She said, or she tried to have a conversation. I think she was trying to relate to me, but what she asked me was, "Where are you from?" And at this point in my life, I'm kind of used to that question. I feel like I have enough sort of defense mechanisms up to be able to diffuse it or answer it honestly if I feel like someone's really wanting to know, or I feel like I kind of developed a skill set to
Right.
answer that question, where are you from? So I said, oh, I was actually, but because that question and this encounter happened after the patient zero comment, the whoa coronavirus comment, and another comment saying like, oh, people are going to want to stay away from you because they're going to think you have coronavirus. Um, when she asked me that question, I was sort of kind of already on edge, and so when she said, "Where are you from?" I said, "Do you mean like where I was born?" And she goes, "No, where are you from?" And so then at this point, I kind of knew like where this was headed, so I went let me just try to like answer as many questions that are not as satisfying to her to see if she like gets the hint. And so she's like, "Where are you from again?" And I said, I was born in Illinois. I grew up in Atlanta. No, what language do you speak? I speak English. No, like your parents, where do they come from? Korea. So then I just finally answer. My parents are Korean, the kicker for this encounter was she goes, "That's interesting because I know some Korean," and she goes, Ni hao," which is Mandarin, not
Right.
Korean.
Right.
So and my resident saw this entire encounter, and I could tell like he felt really uncomfortable with it because he could sense I tried to hide my sarcasm, but I think it was like slipping out.
Yeah.
And I think this is the problem with these, sort of microaggressions is that like in this encounter, I have to be the one that's professional, and
Hmm.
I have to maintain that standard, even as I feel like wounded in the middle of the conversation. And so I think, that's something that um, a lot of my colleagues feel from time to time, whether it's about race or gender or even sexuality. I think, we're made to, in some ways, we're asked to kind of put up with these things while being wounded at the same time. But when I went back to the room, the provider room after that encounter, and I sat back down, um, it just it was a really busy clinic, and then I had a moment to sit back down before I had to staff the next patient with the next resident, and it was just like a fleeting thought that I've had before, but it's been a while since I've had it, and the thought was, my like God, like what do I have to do?
Yeah.
What do I have to achieve for just to be treated like just to be not like to be treated not as the other in this country? Like why am I like I can perfect my English. I can I mean culturally I'm American anyway. Like, I don't have to try there. I can be as kind as I can muster. I can muster as much kindness as I can, or I mean, or I can try to be as kind as can be, and understanding. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, And it was a kind of a fleeting moment. All those thoughts kind of hit me, and bottom line came down to like it doesn't matter what I do, how hard I work, I will not be seen as American in this country. And then the defense mechanisms go back up, and I just get my crap together and I go back to work. But of course, it wasn't the best day. And then when I went home, I called my wife and told her what happened. And, she and her, just knowing me and knowing how to support me, got Chinese takeout, which I was like, yeah, like let's eat that tonight. Um, and so as we're eating dinner, I get a phone call from a colleague who was a faculty colleague who was in the room that day where we were in clinic together staffing patients. And he didn't hear all the comments. He certainly didn't hear like the conversation with the patient that had happened. He didn't hear like how people greeted me that day, like, whoa, coronavirus. But he did hear the patient zero comment, I think.
Hmm.
And he did hear me sort of like vent kind of these one-liners throughout, like, man, like what is going on today? Like, why are people saying these things? So he calls me while we're eating dinner, and it was surprising because we, up until this point weren't particularly close. He's kind of um, I'm trying to think. He's been at Emory for a while and is someone I consider like a role model, a mentor. But we weren't particularly close, and I was surprised to get this call. And when he called, he goes, "Hey, I heard some of the things that were said to you today, and I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Um, and it just completely, that phone call and what he said completely came out of left field. I was not expecting that
Yeah.
because it had never happened before. Like no one had ever like followed up like that, and I guess like saw how it had made me feel, and um, you know had a desire or willingness to want to step in and say something. I actually I'm used to when comments like that happen at work or in public. It's just me to deal with it. Like I just have to, like I have to figure out how to
Yeah.
be okay with it, put on a face, and then move on. But when he had reached out and said that, was like, oh my gosh, it just like in a moment validated the entire like how I felt about it, and it actually made me feel like really safe to
Oh.
talk to him, and so he asked me, at the end of the conversation, we were talking for a while, and he's like, just in general, showing his support. At the end, he goes, how can I be a better bystander next time? And that's a question I'll never forget anyone ever, asking me in terms in the history of anybody asking me a question like, how can I be a better bystander?
Yeah.
Because again, that was a statement. It was a question, but it was also a statement of validation to say like, what you experienced wasn't right. And though I'm not an Asian American or a person of color, see that, and I want to acknowledge that it was wrong. And so, yeah, it was really powerful, and it was a moment that I felt a lot of, I don't know, I guess it was a painful experience that day, but I also felt like a lot of hope and kind of a way forward. Like what is a society in which you have a diversity of races and ethnicities in this country, people who are citizens by right. What does it look like as a society for us to not have a melting pot approach where we say we're all the same? Yes, that is true to an extent, and I believe that, like, we're all the same. We all breathe in oxygen. We all have red blood cells. We all have bones. But I think the disadvantage to that sentiment is that we lose the richness and the beauty and, frankly, just the right for people to have their own culture and grow up differently and have different customs and different foods that they eat, so, and still be American. So I felt like in that moment, in this situation, so it gave me sort of a hope for, um, what our society could look like and how we can treat each other, and how, even as a as an Asian American, and again, Korean American specifically, as a privileged person of color, that yeah, it was just a an unexpected and poignant moment that redeemed what happened that day
Yeah.
for me. I wouldn't want to go through it again, honestly. Um, I think there's still going to be events in the future where those things are going to happen. I know it. That nerve is still there. But what was important is that we had like this dialogue that I never had before. And so then I had a feeling of like acceptance and inclusion that I never had before, especially in a work setting. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of a long-winded version of that story. But and then so he gave me some, or he asked me to, how can I be a better bystander? And then I thought about it, and I in that Facebook post put some suggestions there. Um, and yeah, I was quite surprised by the response I got from it, and I was surprised that it had kind of connected with so many people in my network.
Yeah. What are the, I mean, that story is so poignant and so wonderful, and it's so rare that these stories about microaggressions end with someone being supported and not being
Hmm.
gaslit or ignored or just like pretending like it didn't happen, because it makes everyone uncomfortable. Um, so thank you for sharing it, and thank you for sharing it now and before.
Hmm.
What did you tell him about how to be a better bystander?
Yeah, honestly, I just thought about like what he did and how it changed my perspective about the event, and um, how he how I actually just felt supported. And so the things that I thought of were, one, just don't ignore it if you are a bystander. And by not ignoring it doesn't mean that you have to call the person out in that moment. I mean, if you feel compelled to do that, fine. And if it's a reasonable and safe setting to do that, fine. But there's other ways to show that you're not ignoring it, right? You can clear your throat, or look over and give the person who's receiving that microaggression an eye roll, just to show some solidarity. But 99% of the time, when some comment like this has happened, and I would even say like back at Rush, back at our prior institution, Joe, like when things like this would happen, there's just kind of an awkward silence in the room where people hear it, and I think they like I will give them the benefit of the doubt that they think that it's inappropriate, that it shouldn't be said, but it's not something that they want to engage in, and
Yeah.
that is another cut, right? Because the message that I realize what it's sending is like, this hurt I feel is not important enough to be acknowledged by the room. And so that's why it's always been something that I've just kind of learned to deal with myself. The second thing that I had mentioned as a suggestion was just having a willingness to learn. Um, and I actually thought about this one a lot, or it's been it had been brewing in my mind for a while. And if you would mind me sharing, because
I don't know.
so I grew up in Atlanta, in the church actually. My family's Christian, and I grew up always going to church on Sundays, and my mom is in the choir. She, like, for a time was directing the choir. My dad was a deacon. We grew up in the Presbyterian church, and in Atlanta, um, when I was in high school and college, there was I was kind of in like the Christian praise and worship movement. Like I was just like into that, and there were a couple large churches in Atlanta that were known to have great music, great worship songs, and so my friends, and they would have like weeknight services, and they'd kind of like market themselves to like young adults and college students, and so my friends and I would go, and sometimes I would have to like meet my friends there after they get off work or school or whatever. And I remember going and just feeling like I was like it was mostly a white congregation that was there. Um, Maybe like 7,000 people would show up here on a Tuesday night, so obviously a very large service. But I would go, and sometimes I'd get there really early, and just like wait there alone. And I'd see all these people like coming in, being greeted, and I'm like, wait, I didn't get that kind of greeting when I walked in. And so I just kind of like, that would happen over and over again. I would come to this service, and I like be so excited, and then I'd get there and be like, wait a minute, like how come I can't meet anybody except the Asian people that I come with? How come like I feel like I'm so uninteresting as a person, like I'm not even acknowledged in the room. And then the messages that they would say, week after week, were certainly wonderful in their own respect, but they never seemed to acknowledge like a different reality that I was living
Yeah.
as an Asian American. And so not being greeted or not being acknowledged, like coming into this huge church and then never hearing a message or a sermon that spoke like it didn't even have to be something that would benefit me, but that kind of took a position of understanding me. Um, Not, and it wasn't even something that I was actively asking for, but it was just like is my existence here acknowledged, or am I just a number?
Yeah.
And so out of that, kind of came this sentiment over time of the story that I have as an Asian American is just not interesting. It's just not something that is worth learning to people who are not Asian. It's an experience that is just unique to me, and I have solidarity with my other Asian American friends, but it's not something that the pastor or leader of this church would ever understand or ever care to understand. And so even though Christianity is such a huge part of my life, I'm just going to have to live with the fact that there are people who are, I'm just going to have to like yield this part of my life to be a part of this community that I want to be a part of. And that was just like honestly, a sore tension to have, to not feel like this huge part of me, which I feel like is a good thing. I'm not ashamed of being Korean at all, but a huge part of me was just like, it was like they were saying, like, come on in. We love the fact that you want to be a part of this community. You're a Christian, come on in. But like your ethnicity, like leave that at the door, because like we're not going to talk about that here because we're all Christian and like that's what matters. But your experience as a Korean American, microaggressions, just leave that at the door. Like we're not here to talk about that. That's kind of how I always felt. And so the second thing that I had written down was just, if for a bystander, just be willing to learn. And it felt weird, honestly, writing that, because I'm so used to, again, like the assumption, my default assumption is like you don't want to hear about my experience as an Asian American. Like it's just not, it's not even about like racist incidents that happen against Asian Americans. It's just like our culture in general, as my culture as a Korean American, is not interesting to anybody who is not another Korean American or Asian American. Um, but the reason I put that down, having a willingness to learn, was um, because I think that like that is it's not necessarily like an action that can prevent a future microaggression, but it is a it is so powerful. It hits me so hard when someone's like, you know what, like I don't understand what you've been through, but you've had a different experience than me, and I want to understand that because I care about you.
Mhm.
And so I think that's what it comes down to, is like I've had a lot of people in my life who've cared about me, and they still do, but we've never had like this issue of like me being Korean and them being not Korean. Like we haven't really found a way to navigate that in a way that I feel is honoring to both sides. Um, and it just kind of feels like this grenade that we're like kind of walking around, this issue of race, and like my friends, I know they care about me, but it's like maybe it's vulnerable for them to engage in this. And but I think just having a willingness to learn is a great starting point. And the crazy part is that after I posted this, like all of those friends, I had a kind of a mental list of friends, who I was like, if they just only knew that this is what I had wanted from them, they would do that in a heartbeat. Uh, and so so after I posted it, they all reached out, and I wasn't surprised that they did. And I think our friendships are stronger for it. But it was really through what happened that day that actually gave me the wherewithal to be like, oh, you know what? This is what I'm actually asking for from my friends.
Yeah.
Um, and the third thing that I thought I was just following up. Uh, I think my colleague did not have to call me. He could have gone home. He could have cooked his dinner and saw me the next day and, gave me an elbow, a little elbow rub, be like, hey, that was kind of whatever, right? And I would be like, yeah, it was nothing, it's fine. We could have left it at that. But he called me, after we had left clinic, and wanted to learn and wanted to um, show his support, and that was just powerful too. Like he didn't leave it alone. He thought it was important enough to make a phone call that night. So I think those three things, like don't ignore it, be willing to learn a perspective that is not your default perspective, and following up, to me are the things that would really count for these events that are microaggressions.
That's great. That's such wonderful advice. I'm taking all these notes, so I'll put some of it summaries. I don't want to give it all away, so people will listen
Mm,
to the episode. But this is it's so helpful. And you know, speaking to my own experience, like I am sure that I have committed all the microaggressions. You know what I mean? Looking back, and
mm,
I'm not talking about specifically with me and you. And
mm,
of course, if I did, I apologize. But like, white people are just clueless until they're not. You know,
mm,
and even if they don't have any sense that they have anything to learn.
mm,
And I can say that from experience. So it's so lovely that your reaction was received in the way that you would have wanted it to be, and that it was able to open up some doors and teach some people some things to be a better bystander, to be a better human, to be a better friend, to be a better white
mm,
person. So thank you for that. So as you're talking, and I feel like this is a good segue into the work you do, hearing the constant having your guard up, and knowing that from what you've been saying and from what I've heard, and understood that you called yourself a privileged person of color. So knowing that experience can be so much worse for Black people, in our country in particular, having to endure that all the time. And even if you don't endure it, to be ready. And then knowing that the onus falls on you because of our crappy society to be the one that handles it, to not be allowed to express yourself. The toll that takes. And you said, you know, my sarcasm was slipping through, and I was trying to control myself, and I had to be the good doctor, and I'm supervising the resident and all that. But like, that it falls on you is, there's so many things about this that are horrible, but I'm just thinking about your inner experience, and the sometimes capital T trauma of that, and the sometimes lower T trauma of that, and how that impacts you in your life, how that impacts any person in this country, as you were saying, you know, women or anyone who's anything other than, you know, the heteronormative,
mm,
white male hetero experience, able-bodied,
mm.
what that's like moving forward. And I'd like to transition a little bit into the work you're doing, because the reason I
Sure.
reached out to you about this interview is that for my anti-racism course that I do with my partner, Maisha Claiborne, we wanted to do a module on social determinants of health, but like real style, like honest truth, let's get into it,
Mm,
the racist policies that lead to all this. And so we hired this wonderful woman, Dr. Stacy Schmidt,
mm.
and lo and behold, she's like talking about it, and she starts talking
Yeah.
about adverse childhood events, and talking about this amazing TED talk given by her colleague, Dr. Sonu. And I at this
Stacy.
point didn't know, this is just, I'm watching
Yeah.
her video. I mean, I gave her like all sorts of leeway, just like create what you want to create. And so it was so incredible to hear that you've been doing this work, and to hear that, you know, to be doing a TED talk about it is awesome. So I'd love to talk a little bit about that. The what brought you into this work, I guess,
Mm.
on adverse childhood events, what those are, and how that plays into health and the experience of being other in the
Yeah.
United States.
Yeah. There's definitely a connection there. Absolutely. ACEs, we call them ACEs, so it stands for Adverse Childhood Events or Adverse Childhood Experiences. And yeah, so before I get into that, kind of what the topic is, how I got into it, I was in my fourth year of residency at Rush, and attended no, I was actually, yeah, it was my fourth year of residency, and I went to a grand rounds for pediatrics, and I heard about this, the speaker was talking about ACEs. And it was really as simple as that, just kind of serendipitous attending the right lecture on the right day.
Mhm.
Um,
Before,
but
before you keep going, was that part of your education at all until that lecture that you heard first?
no, absolutely not.
Okay.
Which is, so my jaw was just on the ground as
Yeah.
she spoke, because it, as a med peds doc, right, seeing children and, you know, spending time in the pediatric space, especially in the primary care clinic, and seeing so many of the issues, and then just having the understanding that a child doesn't raise himself or herself, but the way that a child can develop and that child's health trajectory is so influenced by that child's social ecology, right? You kind of understand that very quickly in pediatrics, and that's why I think the sidebar, the pediatrics community is such um, there are so many people who are vocal in the space of advocacy because of that, So seeing that and experiencing that, and then going to the adult space, and then really where you're seeing the consequences over and over again, kind of like a revolving door, whether it's chronic disease or mental health problems or social challenges. um, it you get the sense that there's some kind of connection here, like there's something happening where like kind of these children who are in very risky situations, who live in communities that have been historically neglected, there's just something there where why do we think that, why is our assumption is that they should just be fine when they're adults when we see them struggling as children? And so then this speaker was talking about this topic of adverse childhood experiences, which is derived from this study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which was in the public health world is considered a landmark study, a seminal study. It's not new. Excuse me. It was published in 1998, so now it's over 20 years old. But what the study did was they surveyed over 17,000 adults in total about 10 different categories of what we would consider traumatic experiences occurring before the age of 18. And so they spanned 3 domains of abuse, neglect, and household stress, or household dysfunction as it was originally called in the study. So within abuse, they asked about things like physical or emotional and sexual abuse. Within neglect, they asked about physical or emotional neglect. So the emotional neglect is a really important one. That's framed by the question, did you ever have anybody to talk to when you had a need growing up? Was there someone around who could listen to you?
Yeah.
And then the 5 different types of household stress that they asked about were mental health problems or substance use issues in a family member who was incarcerated, intimate partner violence against the mother, and then lastly, parental separation and divorce. And what they found by asking these 10 questions and then looking at the prevalence of a multitude of health and behavioral outcomes like chronic disease and mental health problems and substance use disorders, et cetera. What they found was this strong, robust dose-response relationship between the number of ACEs people had, so 0 to 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 10, and then their risk of these chronic diseases like chronic lung disease or diabetes, cancer, heart disease, even stroke. For mental health problems, they looked at depression, anxiety, and PTSD. Obviously, they looked at substance use disorders like tobacco use, illicit substance use, and heavy alcohol consumption. And then they also looked at socially important outcomes like financial stability in employment or unemployment, household poverty. And what they found was just kind of this across the board, this sort of dose response relationship between these experiences and the risk of these outcomes. And it makes so much sense, right? I mean, we know, like in society, every episode of Law and Order and like Criminal Minds highlights like the perpetrator having an experience of ACEs, right? And so we understand this kind of intuitively. We know that people who've had a really tough childhood tend to have higher rates of a mental health problem, or maybe it's a substance use disorder. It makes sense intuitively, but to see the data kind of mapped out so clearly is just shocking. To say, like, wait a minute, like, what is the root cause that we're trying to address here in healthcare? Like, what are we doing? Are we about disease management? Are we about controlling someone's high blood pressure, controlling someone's diabetes, and then that's it? Or are we about the business of trying to keep people well and healthy, and where they don't become sick, or they're less at risk of becoming sick? So that's what I signed up for, the latter. At least that's what I thought I was getting into, was the latter when I started med school. And it's not that I disagree at all with disease management. I think it's absolutely what we have to do. But I also think that we need to do that and more. Like we have to push ourselves to be experts in managing the disease with the evidence that we have, but we also have to look towards like how can we prevent this and move the needle and help people live a more healthy and self-actualized life. And so the seeing the data kind of laid out like that was just it was mind blowing. And then there was one statistic where the ACE study was actually a kind of a cohort study where they followed patients for about 10 years. And one study out of this series, they in one study out of these series, they kept track of death certificates. And what they found was that for people who had an ACE score of 0, meaning they had no ACEs, their average lifespan was about 80 years. But for those who had 6 or more ACEs, the average lifespan went down to 60 years. So 80 years, no ACEs, 60 years with 6 or more ACEs. And that's in our country. So that disparity is in our country. And if you think about what the root cause of that disparity is, it's an experience of trauma that occurs before the age of 18. So it totally shifted my focus on like where we have some opportunity as a health system in helping children and eventually adults live a more healthy life. Um, and I will say that, when you've kind of been in this space and you see this relationship, okay, ACEs and health outcomes, negative health outcomes, what next? Well, the what next is when you walk down the street or you drive down the road and you see people driving in their cars or you see people, walking on the sidewalk, you do not know who has or has not experienced trauma. It is not something that shows up on our face. In fact, on the contrary, we are really, really good at hiding trauma. Like we are experts as human beings at hiding what has happened to us in our lives. We don't want to show it, right? We almost actually self-engineer the reverse, where we do not show weakness, we do not show vulnerability, we do not show the things that have hurt us in the past. And so if we don't know who's experienced trauma or not, and one of the other findings from the ACE study is that trauma is common. So almost 2/3 of these 17,000 adults had one ACE or more. So only about 1/3 had no ACEs. So if trauma is that common and it is this strongly associated with so many health outcomes, then what should my approach be as a healthcare provider? And that's where this idea of trauma-informed care that's for me how it sort of makes sense, where you understand the relationship between trauma and health, and then you ask the question, what do I do about it? Understanding that you don't know who if your next patient or friend or colleague or coworker has had ACEs or not. So I think just to finish the thought on trauma-informed care, it's to me kind of starts with this foundational paradigm shift of the way that we understand people's behavior, because one of the I think sort of pillars of understanding trauma is understanding how it affects our brain development and how it reinforces pathways of coping, and can stunt or inhibit the development. Now, I wouldn't say inhibit, but make it difficult for the frontal lobe, for the prefrontal cortex to develop. And so there is this connection between trauma and brain development and behavior as a result that we have to understand. And so the foundational, I think, paradigm shift of understanding trauma-informed care, it's this phrase that a lot of people have said, but it's instead of, if you see, whenever you're interacting with someone who's exhibiting behavior that would be called problematic or dysfunctional or counterintuitive, unproductive, right? They're triggered. They're upset. They're frustrated. In my world, it maybe even it's a persistent behavior that seems completely irrational in the context of that patient. So there's a lady who's 40 years old with 2 children who are teenagers, who I've admitted at the hospital a few times now, and she has severe alcohol use disorder. She cannot stop drinking, and yet she has a failing liver. So she now is end stage liver disease, persistently jaundice, comes in all the time with chronic pancreatitis flares, and I think before kind of understanding this narrative about trauma and health, I think my like the deepest recesses of my mind would have said, like, why can't this lady just stop drinking? Like, she's killing herself, right? And I think we've kind of all said that phrase before, you are killing yourself. And what being trauma informed has sort of opened up for me is the idea that, or the reality is, like, don't you think she knows that? Like, don't you think she knows? Or on the flip side, do you think she thinks that she's living a healthy life by drinking? Like, she knows, like, she's not dumb. She knows what this is costing her, and yet she can't stop. So now the question is not like, don't you know this is bad for you? Now the question is, what is it that is preventing you from taking that step forward where you cut back on drinking, given what you know about your circumstance? And I think that is where our focus begins to shift from pathologizing the behavior to trying to get to the understanding the cause. I think, and so one of the realizations from this is understanding that these sort of problem behaviors or health risk behaviors, like smoking cigarettes, illicit substance use, heavy alcohol use, these are problems in and of themselves, yes, because they cause health consequences, but in an important way, they represent signals of people trying to cope and people trying to manage their stress and do the best they can and live their lives. And so when for this woman, you know, we don't talk about this every time she comes in, but the second time that I met her, we had this conversation. I said, hey, I know like, this drinking is not good for you. I'm not here to talk to you about that. I mean, you already know this. If it was easy for you to stop, you would have done it a long time ago, because I know you love your kids, and I know you want to be there for them. But there is a reason why it's hard for you to stop. There's something driving this, and I wonder if it's something that happened when you were a teenager or a child, some bad thing that happened to you that keeps coming up, something that happened that was never acknowledged, that you didn't get the help that you needed for, you didn't get the support that you really needed in that moment, but you still think about to this day, that it keeps coming up, especially when you get stressed, it keeps coming up. And me just saying that, I'm paraphrasing, but me just saying that, like, it like hit her, like, to her core when she was, crying and tearful. And it's like it wasn't that she was sad, it was almost like she was relieved and like she felt understood. And I think that's the beautiful part about being trauma informed, is that it gives me a skill set to be able to understand people where they are, and for me to understand what the problem is from their point of view. And so it's really helped me strengthen my rapport, my ability to connect with patients so much more. Now, in terms of the original ACEs, right? There were, in the original study, there were 10 ACEs that they included. And if you can remember the list that I had provided, across the 3 domains of abuse, neglect, and household stress, conspicuously absent from that list is racism and discrimination and poverty and economic disadvantage, even historical traumas like slavery or Jim Crow, right? Like mass incarceration, like those are, I think society would say very clearly, like, those are traumas as well. They weren't included in that original 10 ACEs. So just to clarify, the intent of the researchers when they did a study wasn't to, like, draw boundaries around what's trauma and what's not. But my understanding is that that these were questions that were already being asked in other surveys, and they just kind of brought them together into one single questionnaire. Since then, there has been a lot of work in the trauma research community around expanding the definition of trauma to include things like racism and discrimination and poverty and even bullying in schools, and even like natural disasters. So I would put earthquakes and hurricanes, and even this like pandemic could be considered traumatic. And so I think one important trauma to acknowledge is racism. Absolutely. It, it is an insidious trauma. And I think, like you said, there are big T examples of that and little T examples. And I think microaggressions are the little T trauma. And the way I think about it kind of is like for a child who's being abused, let's say physically abused by their biological parent, right? And if that abuse is happening over a long period of time, there is a moment when that child thinks like something must be wrong with me because the person that nature decided was supposed to love me is not loving me, and there's something wrong. Like, but they would love me if I would only fix this. They would love me if I just changed this. And an extreme example of that, I think, is cutting. And I think one way to understand cutting is like, I'm so bad, but I'm cutting myself. Look, mom, see, I'm punishing myself. Now can I be seen as a good kid?
Oh, wow.
And like that just like hits you to the core. So, but that, so this is an example kind of on an individual level. I think on a broader level, community or societal level, racism is in some way for people who experience racism, it's like it's not I'm something must be wrong with me because my parent doesn't love me when they're supposed to, or I'm a bad kid. Now it's something must be wrong with me because I'm supposed to be equal in this country. I'm supposed to have the same rights. I'm supposed to be treated the same way, but I'm not. And so what is wrong with me? And I'm not going to generalize this to everybody's experience, but for me, this is certainly true because if I look back on my life, the way that I responded to microaggressions as a child, I knew that I wasn't going to be able to beat anybody up to, beat their racist thought out of them. Like that was off the table, right? I'm not a fighter. Um, but what I could do was change myself to become more acceptable and to
More
be more
whiteness.
presentable,
Yeah.
right?
This goal
And
of whiteness. Yeah.
yeah, right. And so that was the force that just this desire to be accepted and be okay and just be welcome at the table drove me to change, I think, a lot of the and I'm still kind of deconstructing the ways that I've sort of compromised my values in that way, but um, it took me a long time to get comfortable with just my identity as being a Korean American. There was a time where I would say out of high school and college where I honestly did not want anything to do with being Korean because the college that I went to, Vanderbilt in Tennessee,
Oh,
was
wow.
not a welcoming place for
Oh,
Asian Americans at that time. It was like, if you come here, join a fraternity. If you're not, then um, you're really kind of a social outcast in this Vanderbilt bubble. And so that's the insidious sort of nature of racism and what it does to what it can do to people. And I think I was able to, and this is getting deep, but I think the reason that I chose, okay, I can kind of change my identity to appear more white and make sure that my dialect, my vernacular has no hint of being Asian. I think I went that route because I also could see that as a person of color, I was on that privileged side as a person of color. And don't get me wrong, I mean, I'm not looping every Asian American as a privileged person of color. I'm just saying that specifically for me
right.
as a Korean American growing up in Atlanta, solidly middle class of my family. Like that's who I was. And so it was almost like an opportunistic thing for me that I saw like there's a way I can win out of this. If I just change who I am and be more white, then I'm not going to be seen as the other, right? And so that's something that I'm still kind of like
Yeah.
wrestling through. But I think, kind of big picture wise, at the end of the day, what racism does in terms of how its effect as being a traumatic experience is it it's another message to the person that their needs and their person is invalid, that who they are is not who they're supposed to be. And that is a very, very distressing, and I would even say catastrophic state to be in. To that's when people make decisions that really aren't congruent with their values, with their personality. That's when people really can go to extreme actions and do things that they otherwise would not do.
Gosh, it's so powerful. And thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, I find the internalized part of this so interesting. I mean, I'm
Hmm.
Jewish, and it's like a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of all the things, but I myself find myself not talking about it, not I don't connect to it as much because I'm just not a like organized religion kind of gal at this point in
Hmm.
my life, and I've
Hmm.
seen what that can do. But yeah, like that internalized, like what is my deal with that? Like what is that? And hearing you talk about yours so honestly and so in such a vulnerable way, thank you. I think that's going to be really helpful for people listening to understand your experience. Obviously, you're not
Hmm.
speaking, as you said, for all Asian Americans, but your experience and maybe their own experience in whatever version of marginalized they've been, you know?
Hmm.
So thank you for that and for framing ACEs in a way that like takes it to who the whole person is and our approach to them. And you know, it's so I do some disability work. I'm pointing back because this is my like
Mm.
computer screen. I do some
Yeah.
disability reviewing disability cases on the computer. That's my like kind of part-time gig. And I notice this reaction myself where it's like, oh, so and so didn't get this procedure because they didn't have insurance. And I immediately go to blaming the person for not having insurance rather than blaming the system for being so horrible that it didn't give this person what they needed.
Hmm.
And you know, like the second part is that reaction. I still have that
Yeah.
reaction, but my first thing is like othering them. It's still that
Hmm.
inbred thing. And so the more and I like do anti-racism work and I'm trying to be a nice person. And so even for people who try to be nice people, there's these ingrained responses and
Yeah.
we're not understanding people's traumas and everything that has contributed to who this person is and how they behave and act um, and how they're formed, we're going to just always be pointing our fingers and not really seeing them as full humans and
Right.
that we don't treat them as full humans and we're perpetuating the problem.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think it's really challenged me to kind of being in this space, and the more I sort of learn about the neuroscience behind trauma and brain development, and how much really a baby's brain is substrate for love. Like they respond so well to an environment of love and nurturing. On the flip side, I think the worst ace, if you were to kind of lay out, I mean, not that it's a contest, but one of the worst aces is emotional neglect. When a child does not have a person who tells them that they are loved and that they belong and that they're a part of something, when they're not understood in that way, that is just it's so devastating to brain development, and it almost creates like an irreparable hole in that person's heart that they're always chasing to be filled. And that alone drives so much of undesired behavior that we see today. And it's funny that you mentioned disability, because I think what we're seeing, and this is kind of this is a not the most uplifting thought, but I think it's a truth that we are a society that pathologizes trauma. We, instead of understanding it,
yeah.
we pathologize it and we blame the individual for it. We say things like, I don't care what you've been through, you are responsible for your own actions. That is taken way out of context. It is the person that eventually finds healing out of trauma, but they cannot do it without relational support. So the way out of trauma, the way we heal from it, is actually quite simple. It's restoring that which was broken, which oftentimes are relationships. And people can heal in the setting of a safe, stable, nurturing relationship. There are very good therapies that address trauma, EMDR, dialectical behavioral therapy. There's so many different therapies for trauma that do work, but the foundation for it has to be in the context of a healthy, safe um, uh, relationship of understanding. Um, there was another thought that I had with this, but I forget. I'm gonna have to come back to it.
Or, yeah, I mean, the trauma stuff, I'm fascinated with that. I'm a tapping practitioner, and I've done tapping myself as a human.
Hmm.
Do that, and it's one of the huge things we do is work with people with trauma, and it's so powerful to see the benefits people can have. And in my spiritual role too, as a meditation teacher, there's a group of us doing a lot of work into our role as the teacher slash guru, and the
Hmm.
harm that can perpetuate. And we're
Mm.
actually doing a trauma informed therapy in a couple weeks, like an intensive for some other teachers in my tradition, because it's everywhere. Trauma is
Hmm.
everywhere, and people who
Hmm.
are doctors, spiritual people, clergy, they all need this training to be able to provide the space that's needed for healing,
Right,
uh,
right,
emotional healing or physical healing.
right. And it's funny. So you saying that actually just jiggled my memory a bit.
Oh,
So what I was going to say, the truth that is not uplifting, but it's still, I think, a truth, is that because we're pathologizing trauma, if you look at the life trajectory of children who are experiencing trauma both on an individual level, maybe in the family, but also, and perhaps more importantly, on the community level, which can show up in the form of poverty or unstable housing, food insecurity, violence in the community, neglected schools, right? And if we understand that trauma affects brain development, which leads to changes in behavior, in the type of behavior that it can promote is impulsive behavior, behavior that is not forward thinking, that is absent of planning for the future, behavior that doesn't consider the consequences of actions, right? What we do is you have a child who grows up in that environment. They go to school, they're labeled as having ADHD because they're impulsive, right? They're hyperactive, they can't concentrate. If you're and just so just to understand that what the child is thinking, right? If you have a child who's experiencing trauma in the home and in the community, and you ask them to go to school and be a good student, but their brain feels like there's a grizzly bear in the room, right? If we think there's a grizzly bear in the room right now, how would we be able to have this conversation, right? It totally undercuts and shuts off the prefrontal cortex. We're in survival mode. That amygdala is firing, sympathetic nervous system is triggered. We're not in a state of learning. So if the child goes to school and there's a grizzly bear in the room and they can't focus, they're hyperactive, they're going to get suspended, eventually expelled if they don't get help. Now they're not in school. Now they're they're not in school during the day, and so they might be hanging out with people that they wouldn't otherwise hang out with, right? And so and oftentimes there's just a pattern of like delinquent behavior in kids. And so what we're doing is we're taking children who are traumatized, they fall out of school, they get in with the wrong crowd, then they get arrested and they get sent to jail. And I don't think I've ever told you this, but as part of my fellowship, I did primary care at the Cook County Jail for a year.
oh wow.
And this is kind of part of my ACEs work. And at like the first couple months, I was asking the guys there, I only saw men. I was asking the guys there, like, hey, you know, some of these experiences can affect our health. Have you experienced any of these? And I think the second guy was like, Doc, you need to stop asking these questions because everybody here has experienced every single one of these things.
Wow.
And there's one study that was done in a Florida juvenile sample, and like 95% of those juvenile offenders, those kids, those children had experienced one ACE or more. I think the prevalence of children who experienced four ACEs or more was like 60%, which is incredibly high. So if our jails and our prisons are full of people who have been traumatized, then are we really doing the right thing as a society by jailing people who've
Right.
had to grow up in experiences and contexts that they never asked for?
Right.
And so that, yeah,
With racist policies that led to the concentrated poverty, and that led to the funding of schools, and that led, like, I mean, it's so like
right.
one slash many steps before these ACEs are happening, it's like
They're
impossible.
already set up.
Yeah, they're already set up. Exactly. And it's not like these populations' fault that they're happening. It's like the society, the systemic nature of it points in
Hmm.
that direction. So,
Hmm.
you know, almost trapping people, I think, on some level.
Yeah,
But
I mean, I think it's a total, it is a trap. I mean, it is absolutely a trap that, again, as a society, we just lack an understanding of this narrative. Like and the data is there. Like it's clear. It is so clear that trauma in the home, like when the experience of trauma can promote so many of these undesired consequences, and especially behavioral consequences. Uh, and so to me, it's just we don't have a school to prison pipeline. We have a trauma to prison pipeline, and school is just one stop on the way
sure.
there.
Yeah. Wow. That's a good statement. That's like your soundbite.
Yeah, yeah,
All right. Well, I would love to talk to you about this all day, and we probably should have done 2 interviews, because I feel like we've just scratched the surface.
mm.
But I want to respect your
Oh yeah,
position as a
yeah.
as a physician and educator. So thank you again, Stan, for coming on. How do you have, like, you're like a layperson, and that you're not like, you know, your job is being a doctor, but do you have like a website or social media or anything that you would recommend where people can follow you or the work you're doing? And also, we'll share the link to your TED Talk.
Mm.
So,
Yeah, I do have a Twitter account. I don't update it super often. I'm trying to get better at that. So I guess I could maybe maybe this will help me update it more.
okay.
It's I think Stan Sonu, twitter.com at Stan Sonu. And that's one way. Occasionally I'll post some updates. Um, but if anybody has any questions about this or would like to talk, I'm always happy to talk about these topics, especially. They can, feel free to reach out to me by email, which is stansonu@gmail.com, stansonu@gmail.com.
Great.
Yeah, I'd be happy to connect with anybody who wants to talk through this further.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much, and so much to think about and learn about. And we'll make sure to have some good links for you, for anyone who's listening, in the show notes. And again, thank you. Have a wonderful week.
Thanks for having me.